So today, I guess it's a little bit of an extension on what we talked about in risk management. So we're moving more into emergency management planning, which is essentially, you remember in risk management, we talked about those different categories of events. And it was really about saying, once we categorize the events, we can then start to identify how we can mitigate them. We can start to identify those that are in that high risk or extreme category that are things that we really want to try to eradicate altogether. So we looked at all of those different categories of events. What typically happens when you're doing risk management planning is you also look at what are those potential emergency situations that we could have at our event. And we did address some of those in risk management, but what we want to focus on today is really identifying what some of those things could be, but I guess more importantly, looking at that operational process around what do we have to put in place to make sure that we're prepared to handle or manage an emergency if it does happen at our event. And once again, like all of these sessions, this is really about trying to assist you in understanding how to put a lot of this documentation together. There's reasons why you're asked to prepare this kind of documentation for local government. So I just want to try to, I guess, demystify, the process a bit and try to make it a little bit easier. So we are now, we're up to our fourth session. It's going so fast. So we've got two sessions left after this. So once we cover off risk management and emergency management as one of our little topics, we move into marketing on Wednesday, and then we finish up next week with event teams and succession planning. So if there's anything in those particular topics that you're really interested in me covering, please don't hesitate to drop that into the chat box today. If there's something around marketing, social media, working with media, anything around that aspect of your event, please drop it into the chat box and I'll be happy to address that in our session this week. And the same with event teams and succession planning. If there's anything within that particular topic, so that's looking at things like how to have that really efficient structure for your team, whether you have a fully volunteer team. Some events are fortunate enough to have some paid capacity within their team as well. Then we also have events that are fully paid, more a commercial model. It doesn't really matter what type of team you have. It's really looking at the process of setting up a really efficient team to make sure that you're getting those outcomes and that you're able to share that load across the team. And with that, we're also talking about succession planning, and that kind of goes hand in hand because it's really about, having a real well thought out structure for your event team, and also really good processes and roles and responsibilities in place, which will really assist and support the succession planning of your event. So we'll look at that one next week. So as I said, if there's anything around either of those topics that you're specifically interested in having me cover, please don't hesitate to drop that in the chat box or reach out to your council representative and they'll be sure to let me know. But today we are talking emergency management planning. Look, I can see familiar faces on the screen, so I don't need to introduce myself, but if you're interested at all in finding out more information about myself or Revents Academy or Tilma Group, please don't hesitate to jump online and check us out. Okay, today, emergency management planning. So what we're going to do, once again, look, there is a template for you, and I have made sure that we've developed something for each of our live sessions so that you've got those resources with you. So once again, don't feel like you have to take notes of what I'm talking about, because in addition to getting that resource, which is a template, an emergency management plan template, you'll also have access to the recording of today's session. So just grab some lunch if you haven't already, grab a cuppa and just sit back and listen and think about any questions that you may have as well. I really want to encourage everybody to think about their own events and think about any main questions or any challenges that you may have around this particular topic, because the beauty of jumping on the live session is that you do have the potential to ask questions specifically related to your event. So don't be shy, please pop any questions into the chat box, or feel free just to hold on to them until the end, and we'll have some time for discussion. So the emergency management plan template that you will receive is quite detailed. The idea is we wanted to make sure that these templates were suitable for all different size and scale events. So what we encourage you to do is to go through the template and customize it to your needs. So you can remove any sections that aren't relevant to your event. You might find that you've got some really niche type event that has another aspect of emergency management that needs to consider that perhaps isn't typical, and you might need to add something more into it. But it gives you a really good framework and structure to create that emergency management plan that will be required not only by council but by emergency services as well, to really show that you've considered for your event all of the potential emergency situations that could arise, and you've actually considered how you will handle those. So this is what we're covering today. What constitutes an emergency? And you can probably tell me that. We're going to look at roles and responsibilities in emergency management. And this is not something a lot of committees that I work with actually consider. And often, I guess it depends on the size of your event, what risks your event may bring. But it's really important for you to consider in all aspects of your event, who's actually looking after that aspect of it. We'll look at first aid and security. They're two really important aspects when we talk about emergency management. We'll talk about evacuation, and we'll talk about site plan considerations. And then finally, I'll just wrap up with a little bit around communication and the importance of really good communication in the case of an emergency, and how you can actually protect the reputation of your event, which is really important. So what is an emergency? So this is a really formal definition of an emergency from the Victorian state government. It's an actual or imminent occurrence of an event which could endanger either the health and safety of a person, it could destroy or damage any property or threaten to do so, or it could endanger or threaten to endanger the environment or even an element of the environment. So they're really high impact scenarios around your event. Emergencies, as I was just saying, they can also threaten the reputation of an event. They can seriously threaten the reputation of the event. They can reduce attendance. They can affect the safety of your community, and they can decrease the revenue from the event. So they can have a severe impact on your event. So it's really important considering how you can actually manage them well. And as I talked about before, it's very closely aligned to risk management. So what we considered in our risk management webinar last week, looking at those different categories of risks, as you're working through that and you're starting to brainstorm your risks and you're starting to categorize them, that's when you'll start to identify some of these potential emergency situations. And that's when you get a bit of a red flag where you need to go, okay, that's an emergency situation that needs to be considered in our emergency management plan. The thing with emergencies that's quite challenging is that they can occur without notice and sometimes when least expected. That's why we have to be, as an event organizer, we have to be everything really, when you think about it. Like a lot of people think events are, actually they are fun. I'm not going to say think they are fun, they are fun, but it's kind of this real sexy career, event management, running music festivals, doing all this. There's so much skill required to actually deliver events, and being able to work in stressful situations and in situations where emergencies can happen, it's a tough gig. And I think with anything that we do, if we can actually plan and be prepared and know how we're going to manage situations, then we can remain calm and we have better outcomes with it. So just knowing that they can happen when we least expect it is quite overwhelming. Everybody in your team, all of your committee staff, third-party contractors must be prepared to respond immediately to emergencies at your event. So emergency management is essentially the plans, the structure, the processes that you put into place around your event to reduce the impact of any emergency. So to reduce any impact or physical harm to your attendees or to any person at your event, any impact on the environment, and also to protect any assets. So your emergency management plan, as you will see with the template that you receive, it really allows you to have clear instructions around what you need to do in an emergency situation and who is actually doing it. And the ultimate objective with risk management planning, the ultimate objective is to save the reputation of your event. That doesn't mean that, preventing harm is not an absolute priority, but if you prevent harm, you manage emergencies well, you have really good communication around how you do that, even post-event communications. If you do all of those aspects really well, it saves the future and the reputation of your event. So these are just some examples for you to consider. What are emergency situations? At what point does something become an emergency? I guess the way you would really differentiate, just a risk that you're able to mitigate with an emergency is, like I said before, the emergency is something that can happen when you least expect it. It's actually something that's really hard to plan for, therefore mitigate. So it just can happen like that, a fire, crowd crush. And some of these things, you would have seen these things in the media over the years that happen at events, massive drug overdoses, explosions, severe weather. Who would have thought we'd have earthquakes, but we do, floods. So these are things that can happen. We don't want them to happen. We absolutely don't want them to happen. And we do whatever we can to plan our event at the most appropriate time, to manage the type of people that come to our event. All of those things we obviously do, and you do, to try to prevent these emergency situations. But unfortunately, they can happen. If you've ever had an emergency situation at your event, please share it in the chat box. What else would you consider an emergency situation for your event type? Have a little think about that and share that in the chat box. What are some of the things, even, related to your particular area? Are there key potential emergency situations that all events in your area should be considering? Now, one of the really critical components in being prepared to manage emergency is to make sure that all of the roles and responsibilities are clear. And I love that little comment in the grey circle. Don't exchange business cards at the scene. That's a common comment when you're talking about emergency management. It's so important to make sure that everybody knows who's doing what. So if an emergency happens, everyone kicks into gear and they're able to manage it extremely well and as efficient as possible to get that desired outcome. The other important thing is to make sure that all of those people involved in emergency management, they're having communication, actively having communication prior to the event. So everybody's aware of the emergency management plan. They work together to develop the plan, to implement the plan when necessary. So these are some of the key roles. You have your emergency services. Now, the emergency services are your police, ambulance, CFA, even your local hospital or medical centre. And the important thing to remember is emergency services outrank everyone else at the event in an emergency situation. So in any emergency situation, it is the emergency services that sit at the top in terms of giving that direct order. And it's important to know that. The other typical positions that you will have in your event, and once again, this all depends on the size, the scale of your event, and it's important for you just to sit down with your team and consider this. You might actually have an emergency planning committee as part of your team, or it may actually just be part of the event operations or part of a risk management team, or you just might have one risk management coordinator that also manages emergency management as well. So although this looks like a really formal structure, it actually is a very formal structure. What I want you to think about is how you actually adapt this model to the needs of your event. So as I said, emergency services, then we have what we call wardens. And typically with an event, this is more your larger scale events. So if we were to say, what are all of the positions? You have your chief warden that looks after the administrative responsibilities. So, you know, they manage the emergency management plan from an administration perspective. They arrange any training for staff and volunteers around emergency management. They make sure that all of the systems and communications are in place. They manage any contractors around emergency services. They also do any briefings and debriefings, and they ensure that the right people are in the right spot on the site at the right times. So for example, they don't want the chief warden and the deputy chief warden to be off site at the same time. So they kind of have that control over who's coming and going to make sure that in any point in time during the event, if an emergency was to happen, everyone's ready to jump into gear. The chief warden for emergency is the person that takes control of the situation. Now you can call them what you like. Chief warden, it's a very formal name. I always say to events, you know, just make it work for you. So if you feel like that's too formal or just doesn't feel right for your event, I mean, you don't have to call them wardens, but that's the formal process. And I guess, you know, emergency services, council, government, etc., are familiar with these terms. So the chief warden of emergency takes control of the situation. The only person that overrides them is emergency services, so police, ambulance, CFA, etc. So it's their responsibility to actually ensure emergency services are notified when necessary. They hand over control to emergency services when they arrive. They assist emergency services as required. They make sure that they log any incidents, and they also make sure the entire team is aware of what's happening at all times. So they take charge on site until emergency services arrive. Then you've got deputy chief wardens. So basically that's the same thing as you would have as a deputy president. When the chief warden is not on the event grounds, which happens, then that deputy will assume all of the responsibilities, duties, and control. And then depending once again on the size of your event, you can have area wardens. So they basically look after a particular area. And their main responsibility is to ensure the safety of all of the patrons, the staff, the volunteers, and also to ensure if there's an evacuation required, that they actually manage their area and they get everybody evacuated safely. And then you have security. Security are often on site at events, you know, different quantities, but you often have security at your event, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And typically what security will do at the event in the case of an emergency is they'll assist the area wardens. So once again, they're ensuring the safety of patrons, volunteers, employees, contractors, and they'll assist with evacuation when and if required. Any other staff, any other volunteers that are on site at the time, they basically are directed by the area warden. So whatever their area warden or whoever their area warden is for the particular area that they're working in, they just take direction from them and assist them as required. So that's it. And once again, like I said, you need to think about this for your event. So, and you'll see this in the emergency management plan template. You essentially just need to allocate roles and responsibilities so that if anything ever happens, there's a need for emergency management, evacuation, whatever, you're able to jump into gear and be able to manage it as efficiently as you possibly can. The other thing in terms of roles, responsibilities, and having that efficient process is an event control centre. This can be something as, elaborate as, a big room full of computer screens looking at all different aspects of your site, two-way radios, cameras everywhere, which you often see at major music festivals or sporting events, etc. Or it can simply be one person sitting in one central location where they stay with a two-way radio and a laptop, and they're able to see and know where people are and what's happening from a safety and an emergency management perspective at all times. So this is the brain of your event. We often see at a lot of our smaller regional events, they'll have like an event hub or an information centre. I guess what is really important to remember, because I see this a bit, is you need to have one or two people that maintain that role. The reason I say 1 to 2 is obviously if someone needs to go to the bathroom, someone needs to take a break, etc. But you don't just want anyone kind of jumping into that spot throughout the day, because they need to be very well briefed and understand exactly what's going on. Because if you imagine an emergency was to happen, this person is essentially the communication officer. So they're calling the chief warden on the two-way radio, they're activating or turning on the emergency management plan by contacting that warden. So it's a really important role. They also log all the incidents, they share information. So they basically have a really good grasp of what's happening across the whole event and across the whole venue. So it's a really important, centre or location at your event. I guess the other thing to think about when we talk about an event control centre is what should you have? So if you want to set up an event control centre at your event, a few key things that you might want to include in your event control centre. If it was just a basic control centre, so you see these two ladies here, some two-way radios, laptops. It's nothing too elaborate as compared to the image on the other side, where he's looking at multiple computer screens, watching what's happening across the whole site. But in your event control centre, you'll want a radio, so a two-way radio, at least one. Sometimes you might have multiple radios, depending on the different people you need to be able to contact at any point in time. The map of your site, what's happening where, who's located where, where's security, so a good understanding of where everything is and what's happening. You'll need that laptop. It's also good to have pen and paper. You want the running order or production schedule, so you know exactly what's happening across the day. And it's good to just have a really calm person that's got a good sense of humour. You don't want anybody in that event control centre position that perhaps is a little bit, overwhelmed or anxious or a little erratic. You need somebody that's really calm and is able to coordinate and manage those stressful situations if they arise. So do you have an event control centre at your event? All right, security and crowd control. These are just a few things I want you to consider for your event. Do you need security at your event, and how many? And it's really hard to actually determine how many security you need at your event, what I often suggest to people is either talk to council, or you can ring a security company, because they have some formulas. So they'll ask you a few questions about your event, and they'll often have some formulas. Sometimes the police can also guide you a little in this regard, but depending on how cooperative your local police service is, sometimes they don't like being asked too much. But you want to try to identify how many security you need. And that often depends on the size of your event, the location, the type of your event. If you're serving alcohol, for example, the age of the type of, or the age and the type of people coming to your event. So you need to just be prepared to answer a few of those questions. As I said, speak with Vic Police or to a private security company, and they can assist you to determine how many security you need versus how many crowd controllers, because they're actually two different things. So you can actually have security that are there to protect and observe and watch the safety of patrons, but you can also have crowd controllers. So they're just managing the crowd. So just have a conversation with either Vic Police or private security. And as you may be aware, you can also have plainclothes police at your event as well, but that comes at a cost. So once again, depends on what you need at your event, and you can have that conversation with Vic Police to determine whether or not that's necessary. You need to determine what aspects of the event the security are responsible for, but that can all be determined as part of that conversation. You know, do you just need them on the gate to help, you know, checking bags, etc.? Do you need them around, you know, a really large crowd area? Do you need them around the bar? You need to think about what is that role of security in your event. As I said, what's the role of Vic Police? So you can actually engage the police to be part of your event as well in a number of different ways, just being there, either, you know, fully dressed as police officers at your event. They can come as plain clothes, they can come with vehicles, they can come with dogs. So it's all dependent on the requirements of your specific event, but these are some of the things that you need to think of. You also want to think about, you know, stolen property or lost property, and what's your process for that? What happens with lost property? Where do people take it? Where do people come to collect it? What happens after the event? What happens if there's too many attendees on site, and who actually determines that, and how do you manage that? Really important, because as we've seen before, there can be real emergency situations around crowd surges, you know, people getting out of control. Depending on whether you've got alcohol or not, that can actually add other layers of concern around crowd management. Lost children. How many times do we hear, you know, announced over the PA system at events, you know, a lost child? It's important for you to consider what your process is around managing lost children. Where do they go? How do you make announcements? How do you make contact? How do you manage that? And also, there's a Crowd Places self-assessment tool. So unfortunately, we do have to consider terrorism at our events. As much as we may think that's never going to happen at our little events, it's still a requirement for us to actually consider terrorism and potential terrorism activity at our events. So anywhere where there's a crowd or a gathering of people, it's really important for us to actually take those steps. So there is a Crowded Places self-assessment tool, and I'll share that with everybody in the chat box in a moment. I'll just see if I can get this link. I'll put it in. Sorry about that. I'll drop it in when we come to the Q&A. It's just not letting me copy and paste that. But that's just a self-assessment tool that allows you to determine what you need to implement at your event in order to ensure that you're managing any potential terrorism attacks. And once again, like I said, these things can be sometimes hard to even consider when you think, oh, is that really going to happen at our event? But it's the what if, okay? It's the, if that happened at our event and we weren't prepared for it, how we're going to feel. So we need to put these things in place. And a lot of the time they're mandatory, and your event will not be approved by council if you haven't considered these things. Now, the other consideration is first aid and medical emergencies. So it's important to think about, you know, how many first aid officers you need at your event. So as you can see on the screen, the Department of Health indicates a bit of a guide, which is really useful. So you've got 2 level 2 first aid qualified for events less than 500. Once you get, you know, over the 500 mark, it's based on that additional 1,000 patrons. And then once the next milestone is 5,000 people, and it continues to go up from there. So depending on the number of patrons or attendees at your event will determine how many first aid you need to have. Also depending on the type of your event. So if it's a sporting event, often you'll need to also engage the ambulance service to be at your event. And there's certain other requirements depending on what type of event you actually have. So you need to make sure that you've considered all of that, you've addressed it, and that it's all noted in your emergency management plan. The medical equipment requirements, you know, at a medical site. So the first aid officers will actually manage and coordinate this for you, but it's still important for you to actually have an understanding and an appreciation of what's required. I know I'm saying this a lot, but it does depend on where your event is held, the number of patrons, the type of your event, as to what kind of medical equipment and requirements you have. But a suitable medical site will usually have things like, you know, storage space for medical supplies. They'll have, you know, a comfortable climate controlled area. So if somebody does have, you know, an issue with hot or cold exposure, you know, somewhere for people to go and just feel comfortable and recover. Typically, they'll need to have power and running water and adequate lighting, access to a disabled toilet. And the other important thing, and we'll consider this as well when we look at site plans, is clear access for paramedics or for emergency services. So if you've got large crowds, this is really important to actually think about how they're actually going to get in to your site to access. But like I said, if you have good consultation with the first aid providers prior to your event, then they can make sure that they have the facilities that are suitable and adequate for your event. So as you can see, there's lots of different resources out there that actually help you determine what you need. So when you start to think about, all right, what first aid do we actually need? You'll find the resources and the support networks to actually assist you with that. Now, look, none of us want to have to do this. None of us want to have to evacuate our event. But in your emergency management plan, you do need to outline what your emergency evacuation procedures will consist of. So under what circumstances will you evacuate and how will it be done? And that includes how you will alert attendees. So your chief warden will take the lead here. They'll determine if and when to evacuate. And that will depend on how severe the incident is, the likelihood of the incident escalating. So if it is something like, you know, flooding or severe weather, you know, it's the chief warden's call to determine how much that's going to escalate, because it can be that fine line of, you know, impacting the event and having some of those negative consequences versus managing that potential incident before it actually happens. They also need to consider the incident becoming uncontrollable beyond their resources. So you don't want to let it escalate too far and then you don't have the resources to actually manage it. So tough gig, right? But that's the responsibility of the chief warden to make that call. And then you have the emergency procedure. So this will obviously depend on what the emergency situation is. You know, if it's a fire, explosion, a medical emergency, whether it's a weather incident, hazardous materials spill, heaven forbid, a bomb threat. But depending on what that emergency situation is will determine what the procedure of evacuation is. But what I've outlined is just a really generic process of evacuation, which is, you realise the need to evacuate. Like I said, that's the chief warden. The appropriate staff assess the situation, notification is given. As you can see, it moves down, and then you wait for emergency services to assess. So it's a standard process, and I guess the most important thing for you is just to know who's doing it. As you can see, it's a pretty important role for the chief warden. So making sure that you've actually nominated somebody to take on that responsibility is really important. Now, just a couple more things. Site plan considerations. We're going to cover off on site planning in one of our little bite-sized recorded sessions, but I just wanted to touch on a few things around emergency management. So when you're looking at your site plan, there's some really key things you need to consider in case of an emergency. So the emergency vehicle access. So you want to note on your site plan the location, where the actual access will be, where the area wardens will be around that area. So who's actually responsible for meeting them. And it's always useful just to have that conversation, particularly with CFA, ambulance, police, and ask them what kind of space they need to access the event site. If it's an event site that gets used quite a bit, then they might already have some suggestions around the access points. You also want to note on your site plan where the event control centre will be stationed. You want to make sure you've got your first aid stations or any other significant first aid equipment noted on your site plan. Your evacuation routes, your assembly points. It's always good as well to note where those heavy crowd density points are on your site plan. So if you've got a main stage, for example, and at certain times during the day, you're going to have 70 or 80% of your crowd in that particular area, it's always good just to highlight those areas, because that also helps you identify positioning of security, first aid, etc. And similarly is also really good to do the same around where are the alcohol service points. We know from experience that when there's alcohol and where there's alcohol can often lead to some incidents as well. So making sure that you actually have that noted as a bit of a higher risk location within the site is a really good thing to do. Now, finally, the importance of good communication. Like I said at the start, one of the core objective when we talk about emergency management, or what are we trying to prevent from happening? Obviously, we don't want people to be hurt. We don't want to have any emergency situations at our event. But if there is an emergency situation, one of the key priorities is to make sure you don't impact on the reputation of the event. You want to be able to manage the situation well so that it doesn't impact the future of the event. You want to be able to bounce back from any kind of emergency situation or crisis. So some things to think about in terms of the communication. I want you to think about what system is in place between you as the event organiser, between the staff and volunteers and emergency services. So there needs to be a good communication system in place and have a backup system. What's the communication system with your event attendees at your event? So thinking about what happens if there is an emergency, how do you communicate? How do you communicate an evacuation to your attendees? What's that system? Is it a big PA system with loudspeakers? Is it through a mobile app device? How do you actually get that message out to people on your site? You also need to think about how staff, volunteers, and contractors will all be briefed pre-event. What's the process for doing that? How will you make sure that they've always got the most up-to-date information? Once again, is that through some kind of app on a device, or is it through, communication through two-way radios? Is it through phones and text messaging? How are you going to do that? What are you doing to ensure attendees come prepared? And I'm going to share with you a little example in a second. But it's also good to make sure that attendees come prepared so that they, if there is an emergency or if something happens, they've already got a bit of an appreciation of what that system or process will be. They know where emergency evacuation routes are. They know assembly points. They know, what they need to do if something happens. And once again, that's that fine line of, obviously not going to put the fear in your attendees before they come, but it's that, just making them aware. There's a couple of good examples. The Deniliquin Ute Muster near the New South Wales Vic border, they actually are really good at communicating to their attendees on, the road safety, because obviously they have a lot of people that drive utes, young ones, they like to drink. So they actually put out, it's like a 10 commandments. So these are the things that you are agreeing to when you come to the Denny Ute Muster. So, not drinking and driving, behaving well, a series of things, which is really cool. And they do it in a fun way, but it's just putting that responsibility onto the attendees and making them aware at the same time. And then the final thing I just want you to consider is, who's your media contact? This one's quite important, because if there is an emergency situation at your event, if you have to evacuate for some reason, if something really, significant does happen, then you need to try to reduce the negative publicity, the potential negative publicity, and any reputational damage that may come with that. So having somebody that understands how to manage media, particularly in a crisis, so that crisis media comms type position is really important. So have a think about that, whether that's somebody, whether that's somebody in your team, whether that's somebody, within council that's able to do that on behalf of some events. You need to think about who that will be and how that will actually happen. The other thing to consider, it's not just about, our traditional media, but we also have social media. So when there is an emergency or an incident, you would have seen this yourself through different social media channels. People are really quick to jump on with video or social media commentary around a serious incident. So we need to also be prepared to manage and handle that as well. So knowing who's going to respond to that, who's going to manage that media is important for you to consider as part of emergency management planning. Now, I just want to share this example with you. It's a really great example. It's from the Birdsville Big Red Bash in Queensland. And I just love how they manage. So obviously they're in a really remote location. They get 10,000 people that travel out to Birdsville. They don't have medical services in Birdsville. It's a very remote location. They also have a large number of elderly people that travel out to go to that particular event. So people that often need medication and have some, health challenges as well. So they've got some really unique challenges around managing emergencies, particularly medical emergencies. And they do a really good job at, making sure that their attendees are prepared before they come. So I just want to share this little quick video with you that they share with all their attendees before they come to the event. I'm just going to make sure you got my sound on.
Hi, I'm Lucas, the event director for the Big Red Bash. Look, the Bash is one of the most remote music festivals on earth, and it's right on the edge of the Simpson Desert. So because of that, the nearest pharmacy or hospital is over 600 k's away. We've got a really great team comes out from Queensland Health and Ambulance, and they set up a clinic in Bashville with doctors and paramedics and all sorts of fantastic equipment. There is a small clinic in Birdsville, but it's not a hospital and it's not a pharmacy. So make sure you bring plenty of your own medications. And now would be a really good time to visit your GP for a checkup. Out on the edge of the desert, there's pretty much no phone reception at all. So you might get a little bit with Telstra up on top of Big Red, but that's about it. In lots of other ways, coming to the bash is a bit like going back in time. So make sure you're ready to get off the grid for a few days. So what we mean by that is let your family know that you'll be out of touch. And if there's an emergency back home, they can always find you through Queensland Police. Bashville's a bit like its own country town. We've got our own emergency services, but of course without phone reception, you might not be able to call 000. If you need help, you can call us up on UHF CB Channel 5. But before you do that, before you call up, make sure you can describe where you are. So looking out for street signs, the number on your nearest toilet block, or use the interactive map on the Bash app. And look, because that Channel 5 is so important for emergency purposes, make sure you keep the kids off it so they don't clutter it up with their chatter. Or you can always just come up to the security crew who are based at admin, and they're there all the time, 24/7. So look, we hope you don't need any of this stuff, but keep it in mind just in case you do.
So you can see how they're just wanting to make people aware before they come. So what to expect, just giving that information is so powerful to people, so that it's not necessarily taking the responsibility off you, but it is putting some responsibility onto your attendees, making sure they understand. They're obviously servicing a really particular market. It's a very unique event in terms of its location, but there's ways that you can do that for your event as well, in terms of just making people aware. Like I said, the Deniliquid Ute Muster, they have a lot of younger people that drive, revved up utes. They love to drink rum and coke. Very different market, and they do that in a different way. They don't necessarily give them information in a video format like that, but they give them their 10 commandments and say, we agree to behave in this way at the Denny Ute Muster. So it's just about making sure that people are prepared. So communication is so important when we talk about emergency management for your events. So it's something that you'll see in the emergency management plan template. There's a section where you can actually outline how you will do your communication pre-event, during event, and also post-event, and also who's going to play that key role in terms of managing your traditional media and also your social media in the event of an emergency. And that's all I have to share today. I'm just going to jump into the chat box. If anyone has any other questions, comments, or you'd like to share anything yourself, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and jump in. Just looking here at what comments you had around your events. Oh gosh, you guys have certainly dealt with some great medical emergencies, although an animal escape, that doesn't sound good. Crowd crush. Well, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone have any questions around emergency management planning? I'm actually just going to try to find that link quickly to share with you that I promised.
The only thing I was going to say, Linda, looking at your some of your information, you've actually left off SES, which are a major rescue authority, rather than CFA.
Okay, in what instance would they come in for an emergency?
So
as compared to CFA?
So CFA plays fires.
Yeah.
So typically, if I think about our event, we have rides. So if a ride was people were to be entrapped in the ride was to break down, people need rescuing, that's an SES job, not a CFA job. If there was a road crash here, that's a SES job, not a CFA job. So
Good
there's a
pick up. Yeah. So they would come into the emergency services responsibility section.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Linda, we usually have the fire brigade, the SES, the police all involved in our parade.
As having floats, etc.
Just
Is that what you mean?
Their vehicles are all in it as part of the parade. And we usually leave space, if we do have rides, etc., for the emergency vehicles to get through too. And they're things that we've practiced over the years, that we always make provision for them. There's quite a few hints that you had there that perhaps we haven't thought of, but we usually do have a chain of command and walkie-talkies and that sort of thing. I think mobile phones are also useful in our area. There's good reception of mobile phones. So
yeah, and they're all the things you just need to work out, Marg. Like, it's not, you obviously don't need to consider absolutely everything that I've talked about. You know, it's important to work yourself through the template and consider all of these different things. But you'll find that there'll be things that are much more appropriate to your event than others. You know, as long as you've got that chain of command. I think I say this with every aspect of events. If you've got, and this is one of the focus points of the event team session coming up next week, is all around having really clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So when we talk about risk management and emergency management, you said you've got your chain of command. That is fabulous, because I see a lot of events don't have that. They don't actually have it clearly specified who is, you know, the chief warden, if you like, who is actually going to be the one that makes that call. Because you don't want to be in a situation where an emergency or a crisis arises and it's like, we don't know what to do, who's making the call? And, you know, there can sometimes be some conflict around that because you don't have those clear responsibilities outlined in advance. It's the same for all aspects of planning an event. Have clear roles and responsibilities so everyone knows who's making decisions on what, and it will just make things flow much better, be more efficient, and you'll have less negative consequences. Jenny has just put in a comment. What do you suggest re-security to enforce double backs requirements and crowd maximum limit for less than 5,000 person outdoor event, temp fencing, security? Well, yeah, Jenny, I can't really answer that, only because it's changing all the time. And I've been watching what's happening in Victoria, working towards actually doing, you know, the COVID bite-size webinar, because we want to make sure that we're giving you the most up-to-date information when we do that. The challenge right now is there's still so many unknowns. And I always say to people, it's like there's more questions than answers at the moment when we look at events and the future of events. What will vaccination have to be mandatory? We don't even know yet. There was an article that came out a couple of days ago from Peter Noble, and he is the director of the Byron Bay Blues Festival. And we all know what they've been through over the last couple of years. And he made a statement that he will not mandate vaccination for Byron Blues Fest next year. And at this stage in his conversations with the New South Wales Health, it looks like he'll be able to put on a Blues Fest, not unlike 2019. But what does that mean? Once again, there's so many questions around that, right? What does that mean? How does he do that? We don't know what those operational implications are going to be for events yet, whether it be rapid testing instead of double vax requirements. You know, on the other hand, Greg Donovan at Big Red Bash in Birdsville and he's also starting one in Broken Hill. Their team have made double vax mandatory for their event. So as the director or organizer of an event, you are able to make that call yourself to say, we will mandate if you think that's going to protect the health and safety of your people. But at this stage, there's no clear direction around what events will be required to do. And who knows what that, the less than 5,000 people, that is all changing so often. And we're still in this environment where it's all changing. I wouldn't feel comfortable to give you any advice on that at the moment. And not only feel comfortable, I don't know what advice to give you because I have just as many questions around that. But what we want to try to do is get some clarity around some of that and make sure that when we give you our COVID webinar, that we've got the most up-to-date information for you. My gut feeling at the moment is that things are starting to settle. And based on some of the decisions the government's making, hopefully, in the next few months, there might be some kind of framework around festivals and events. But at this stage, it's still too many questions.
I'll just add to that, the tests that they're doing in some of our regional areas, so East Gippsland and Greater Bendigo and Warrnambool, I think it is, and a couple of others, they're allowing some of those places to run events like the racing, and they are running them as a test to see how they will do it, and they are doing it for people only. So that might be an indicator, but we don't know. We might have 6 months of double vaxxed, and then once we get to a good balance, they might ease that for unvaccinated people later down the track. And then in terms of fencing, an online meeting I attended some months ago before this current lockdown, one of the things that they did say, which was the Department of Jobs precincts, and I forget that acronym, but they said that they don't like those sort of open events where you can just sort of find yourself in an event site. That's not going to be okay. That your event site has to be determined, and people have to make a conscious decision to go to that event. It can't just be an open area and people find themselves there whether they want to be there or not. So you do
that's interesting.
So, which is key for a lot of our community events, because I know that that's not the necessarily being the vibe. People come in from multiple directions, but I think that, I don't know, we don't know for sure, but I think indications are that you're going to have some way of saying this is the entry to the event.
Which will have a big impact on a lot of events, smaller events, in terms of their operational management around that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole.
Okay, and I suppose think about it, doesn't need to be necessarily 6 foot high, security fencing. It might just be, bunting that marks the site. It doesn't.
Except, Nicole, if there is a mandate for double vaccination, you've got to be able to control entry. So the bunting isn't going to control entry on those open space sites. That's the only thing. So
we'll have to see how that plays out, but I just don't think that if they turn around and say that you've got temporary 6 foot high fencing, then that just puts everyone, budget won't allow. So therefore,
there
has to be. Anyway, we'll see what comes out of it, but
I'm not sure about a parade either. For a parade, you wouldn't. People who watch a parade would not be in a position to be, give notice that they're doing that. I wouldn't imagine.
And it might, as I said, it might be just a short-term thing that we have the double vaccinated, density quotient requirements in the short term, and then when we hit a percentage of vaccination across from 5 upwards, they might then say, well, we don't have to screen people anymore, but we don't know that yet. So.
It's so interesting, you know, and also a little bit frustrating that all our states and territories are different and we couldn't just have a national approach. I appreciate that, you know, with each state's in a different situation somewhat with COVID, but just to give you an example, I mean, if Victoria and even New South Wales do look to Victoria, and I absolutely appreciate that we've been so fortunate up here, you know, in terms of cases, etc. But we had the Toowoomba Carnival of Flowers in my hometown last month for the whole month. The street parade, Marg, went ahead, everything went ahead, and the street parade, there would have been 100,000 people lining the street. No social distancing, no masks. It was like nothing was happening. Yet there were cases in Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and 90% of those people were from Brisbane and the Gold Coast. So it just blows my mind how different it is, you know, and we're all in the same country. I just would like to hope that Victoria and New South Wales can, with our events, we can get back to that. But like Nicole said, I think there will be this transition period. It's what that looks like that is so unknown. What does that transition look like? And what does that mean for you? You know, what does that mean for your next event? Will it impact your next event? Won't it? And that's what I mean about there being so many questions. You know, it's tough. It's tough to even think about planning for next year still, which is a shame. Can we finish on a positive?
Sorry.
I feel like I need a real positive or something to end on, but I don't have one.
Summer's coming for us down in Victoria soon.
Yay!
Not today, but
we will get out of this, and it's
yeah,
really good. It's a really good opportunity to spend some time thinking about your events and making the changes that you might not have had the time or headspace to do in the past. So that there's heaps of, you know, if you focus on the positives, it's for events, it's around the planning and the chance to really think about what your event is and how it looks for the future and going forward.
Well said. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon. I'll chat to you in a few days.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.